Hello and welcome back to the 3D Blu-ray bunker. This is where I look exclusively at films on 3D Blu-ray, not to do a movie review but to focus almost entirely on the 3D, with just a short word at the end about the film itself. And this time I'm looking at Godzilla vs. Kong from 2021. It's got an aspect ratio of 2.39 to 1 and it was post-converted into 3D. I think there's some good 3D on show in various parts of the film, and there's the odd bit of excellent 3D. But there's also quite a lot of what I'd class as fairly ordinary 3D, stuff that's just not really in any way noteworthy, and a lot of this mediocre stuff is frequently the kind of thing that's been done a lot better in other post-converted films, so I'm going to assume that the budget for this one maybe wasn't up there with what the best ones cost. So here's a shot that's probably not very interesting from most people's point of view, but from this review's perspective, I think it is. We're with Millie Bobby Brown here, looking out of her window as her Judas Priest-loving friend arrives. So this is literally a window-boxed view. It's an almost flat backdrop, set back a clearly noticeable depth beyond the window, and that sort of sums up a lot of the film. There are plenty of shots where there's certainly a lot of depth beyond the window box of the screen to the view in the distance, but maybe not a whole lot going on in 3D space within that view. And to my mind, depth alone isn't at all interesting unless there are things at significantly different depths within the view, what people call layering. And sometimes that's especially disappointing when it feels like there were opportunities to put more separation in between the various elements, like these craft and the trails coming off them, but they only look like they've been put into a very limited bit of their own 3D space. And I do think the film is full of examples of this, where a lot more could have been done if they'd been prepared to implement stronger 3D. So shots like this offer very little in the way of interesting 3D. Of course, those who would judge the strength of 3D by seeing how blurry the image is without the glasses on might think these look great, but that's only because the entire image is set away beyond the screen. There's just a very limited amount of volume within the view. One of the ways this is overcome in the film, or maybe you could argue that it's perhaps one of the problems that they encountered in trying to make good 3D, is that a huge amount of the film is slathered in lens flare and muck on the lens. It makes J.J. Abrams look like an amateur. There's so much of it. And this lens flare is quite reasonably the thing that's foremost in 3D space. Obviously the conversion team had to work around all of this lens flare, and I guess they used up quite a bit of their 3D depth budget in placing this in the foreground. And also, there have been other post-converted films where the multi-lens element flare has been wrangled into really nice 3D space, but that's not done here. Adam Wingard has a very listenable director's commentary track on the Blu-ray, and he comes across as a personable fellow with a lot of interesting things to say about the film. As is often the case, though, the director talks about the film's 3D a grand total of 0 times, and I do sort of wonder if he's ever even seen it in 3D. One of the things he does mention, though, is that he loves holograms, so another mild disappointment is that this hologram, whilst it does have a bit of volume to it, it doesn't feel to me as spherical as it ought to, and that's a bit odd, as I'd have thought that this could have been fairly easily rendered in native 3D. Maybe it was, but just not all that brilliantly. There are some other hologram scenes which I thought looked better, with more solidity and separation to them, but several other 3D films have used holograms in 3D space far more elegantly and effectively. The film's full of moments where the shot might look ripe for some pop-out action, but at best it does it very mildly. For example, not only do the end of these gun barrels stay on the far side of the screen, but there's only a very limited amount of depth beyond them. Kong throws a tree trunk spear towards the screen here. Even then, it's breaking the frame so much that it wouldn't be a great pop-out shot, even if they had put it a good way into negative space. It's a similar thing with the jet here. It hardly comes in front of the screen as it flies towards us, and like that massive spear, it breaks the frame to a large extent anyway. One of the criticisms of the film is that it gave fairly short shrift to its human stars, and focused much more on the monsters. I know, it's called Godzilla vs. Kong, so you could reasonably argue that that's just as it should be, but it's not a dissimilar thing with its attention to 3D, so barely any human face is ever sculpted into solid and realistic 3D space, and most of the dialogue close-ups have very little going on in interesting 3D. So again, faces are something that's been done much better in other converted films. There's other stuff where good 3D could really help to sell the shot, like the menacing monsters inside these eggs, but there's not really any of the depth beyond the shell that you'd expect to see. Post-converting dense foliage, especially when the camera's moving, is incredibly difficult, so it's no surprise that some of it's quite smeared into the wrong 3D space here. But putting a load of separation into all of the people in a crowd shot should be much easier, as it's often been done very well in other 3D films. But here, well, you kind of get the picture by now. There's a lot of what I think is mild and uninspiring 3D on show here. Thankfully, though, there is quite a bit of very pleasing 3D in here too. Like particles of one sort or another are often put into their own 3D space, and I think these are amongst the film's better 3D views. So rain sometimes looks quite nice, as do bubbles underwater, or a nice moment where Kong's in a curtain of water taking a shower and droplets splash out towards us, and quite a few debris shots of one sort or another where they do a pleasing job of creating some real volume to the shot. I think one of the best of these features some leaves along with a much better view of those trails we saw previously. This is a really nice 3D view. Whilst that view of those trails looks very nice in 3D out in the open, when they fly into a tunnel, it sort of doubles up on what's on offer along the Z-axis. So this is very nice and solidly good quality 3D. There's another moment in a tunnel which is very similar to a shot in the film Passengers, where the thing that's effectively moving through 3D space is a sequence of lights coming on. It's typically brief, like most shots in this film, but it's quite a creative bit of 3D. And better than that, there's a tunnel which appears at an extremely key dramatic point, which as soon as we see it, it looks excellent. And then the reverse view of it is where I think the 3D in the film shifts into the status of really special. There's great depth throughout the tunnel, and those embers sit along the Z-axis, making this another one of the film's standout 3D views. This is excellent stuff. It's also a great example of where the view in 3D makes a massive amount more sense than the same view in 2D. One of the more enclosed locations where the 3D works quite nicely is in the cockpits of various craft, where the sense of the enclosed space is captured quite well through the use of 3D. It's not exactly special, but it's nice enough. And pleasingly, the monsters' faces and heads are given much better treatment than the human faces, so they often have a lot more of a solid feel to them. I think that the first really great 3D shot in the film comes with these smoke trails off the back of some missiles, as the camera gently moves forwards amongst them. There was a very similar view in The Great Wall, and it's a shame that this shot is so brief because it's fantastic, and it was actually quite startling to suddenly see such a properly lovely 3D shot. Although it's maybe a bit of a surprise that we never get the view of the missiles coming towards us in strong 3D. The film does sort of threaten it here, but the 3D's not doing anything like as much as I wish it was. Although as this shot progresses, we get another awesome piece of 3D with the view of even more missile trails than in that earlier scene. Now, you may not agree with this, but I've often heard it said that 3D is a perfect fit for a giant monster movie, but I'm not at all convinced that it is, and the reason I say that is because 3D can play some great tricks with scale. So, with a lens separation that matches the human interocular, things are going to feel like a similar sort of size on screen as they would feel in 2D, but one of the tricks you can do with 3D is to move the lenses much further apart to create hyperstereo shots of distant views. Think of something like the cityscapes in Doctor Strange, and I think these views can be incredible, but I know a lot of people don't like them, maybe because their brains interpret the view as making the scene look like a miniature, which it certainly can. Another 3D trick is to place the two lenses way closer than our eyes, which makes for a high pose stereo view, so that tiny things can be made to look large, like there have been a few 3D documentaries about insects, for example, something that you can't see in effective 3D in real life, but using this technique they can be made to look huge. So what I'm getting at here is that whilst 3D can certainly make tiny things look massive and massive things look tiny, I'm not at all sure that 3D can be effective in making massive things look more massive. VR, on the other hand, is all about that, and I'd always say to people that the most extraordinary thing about VR is the sense of scale that it it can bring. Traditional 3D like this, though, I just don't think is geared up to do that. The only way that I think it might work is when there's something else in the shot for scale reference, so I think that this shot is slightly hyperstereo. That's to say, the humans are made to look deliberately smaller than they otherwise would, and maybe because our brain accepts that they're humans and therefore must be human-sized, then Kong must therefore be gigantic. But then again, pretty much the same logic would apply if the shot was in 2D. In other words, I don't think that 3D can add much in terms of emphasising the scale of a pair of titans going up against each other, and certainly as far as this film goes, I don't think it does. Speaking of hyperstereo cityscape shots, like that fabulous one of New York in Doctor Strange, here's a view of Hong Kong, which, given the same treatment, could look absolutely majestic. But here, though, there's only the very, very mildest amount of separation in between the buildings, and for me this is another real disappointment, although it would also have been annoying if this had been a great 3D view, as they'd have almost immediately spoiled it by slapping this text all over it. Now, I said that a lot of people don't care for hyperstereo views, they think they're unrealistic, which they are from a human eyesight point of view. I wonder if there's any way then in which an awesome hyperstereo shot of Hong Kong could have reasonably been worked into this film. I mean, it's almost impossible to think how they could have justified it. You'd need to have had some sort of unimaginable creature with an interocular measured not in inches but in feet to be able to realistically include their point of view shot. And I just can't think how they could be expected to shoehorn something as crazy as that into their film. Ah well. Having said all that, there is actually a bit where some comparatively drab-looking tall buildings do feel like there's a slightly wider stereo base, so I think this view is a bit more three-dimensional than the gorgeous nighttime neon Hong Kong, but it's hardly spectacular. There's some other minor nice stuff in the film, like a few top-down views, where I always assume it's the natural lines of perspective that help to flatter the 3D, but they look pretty good, both on a small scale, like someone going down the ship's ladder here, or looking down on the big old lizard in between a couple of skyscrapers, and whilst this explosion on the ship covers a very limited amount of 3D space, a similar view looks much nicer when they include those missile trails on the left, which are put nicely into the foreground. So it's a bit of a mixed 3D bag in this film. I'd say on the whole it's mostly relatively conservative in its use of 3D, but that meant there were a handful of standout very good shots throughout the film. And then there's this shot. I'd imagine that James Cameron looked enviously at this bit. It's like a field of unobtainium in a 3D view that's maybe more impressive than any in Avatar. I think this is a stunning piece of 3D, just sublime. It's completely dazzling how every one of these rocks is placed into its own discrete 3D space, filling the Z-axis from front to back. It also leads on to one of the film's very few overt moments of pop-out, when Kong nudges a couple of the rocks out into negative space. I don't expect anything as strong here as Sammy the Turtle coming out into your room, but at least there's a little bit of something clearly in front of the screen to enjoy. To my eyes, this view is so obviously brilliant that I'd imagine that most people who've seen the film in 3D would cite it as significantly the best bit of 3D in the film. I think, though, that my second favourite bit might not be quite so obvious, and it's in this all too brief moment where some of the out-of-focus embers in the foreground are all placed into different 3D space. It disappears almost as soon as it's appeared, but it's kind of artistic and beautiful, and it almost took my breath away, a moment where the conversion team did something genuinely creative with the 3D, above and beyond what I might have expected. So this is where I have just a very quick word about the film itself, and I should possibly be forbidden from commenting about Godzilla films, not just because I've never seen any of the Japanese ones, but because of the 4 American ones that I have seen, the only one that I really thoroughly enjoyed was the Roland Emmerich, Matthew Broderick one. On the optimistic assumption that anyone's still listening after that confession, it may be worth saying that when I first watched Godzilla vs. Kong, about 3 months prior to seeing it in 3D, my reaction was fairly negative. I thought that there was far too little emphasis on the human characters, and that seeing a couple of giant creatures fighting each other wasn't all that interesting. And also I thought the little girl, who's played by Kaylee Hottle, had scenes with Kong that were mawkish and silly. Anyway, watching it again, I felt there was quite a bit more to the humans than I first appreciated, and I really enjoyed some great choreography in the monster battles, and the deaf girl scenes with Kong were beautifully played and suddenly genuinely emotional. I guess it's all about the mood you're in when you watch a film that can alter how you perceive it, to point out the extremely obvious. But I also think that, all things being equal, your state of mind can have some effect on how your brain processes the 3D. At the end of the day, though, the ultimate quality of the 3D is baked into what's on the disc, and whilst this film has enough good 3D to make it well worth recommending, for the most part, I'd say it's pretty average at best. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for a look at another 3D Blu-ray. Until then, thanks a lot for looking in on this one. Cheers for now, bye bye.